Welcome to Firefighting Today, the weekly video roundtable discussion show where we discuss all things fire service related. Firefighting Today is a production of PeteLamb.com. And now your host, Chief Peter Lamb.
Welcome and good evening to Firefighting Today, the weekly roundtable where we talk about all sorts of things fire service related. So tonight we're kind of going off the tactical stuff. We're going down the officer path a little bit. And the topic of the show tonight is making the hard right decision. And we've got the panel we've got assembled is a good panel for you tonight. We've got pretty much all facets of it. So we should have a good show tonight. So logistical, if you're watching us live on YouTube, feel free to use the YouTube chat. We do have some viewers already, so if you watch it right off the YouTube channel, you can go over to the YouTube chat and interact with us. The other way you can do that is if you are watching us live, if you send a tweet on Twitter, if you use @PeteLamb, we should be able to pick that up as well and follow you along and insert your questions or comments into the panel. So without further stalling here, let's introduce the panel, and then we'll get started with a couple of overhead questions. Chief Pernesti, say hello.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joe Pernesti. I'm an assistant chief with the City of Elyria, Ohio Fire Department. Thanks for having me again.
Glad to have you, Joe. Chief Cagnos, say hello.
Hello, everyone. Chief John Cagno, North Province Fire Department Battalion Chief, retired and founder of Lead It, and thanks for having me again.
Good to have you, John. Chief Burns, retired. Say hello.
Yes, hi, Chief, and everyone. Kevin Burns, retired Deputy Fire Chief with the Framingham Fire Department in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Kevin. Always a pleasure to have you back. Lane, say hello.
Lane Woolery, Battalion Chief with San Diego Fire Rescue.
Perfect. And that audio was good, video was good, Lane, so we solved the tech issue there. Chief Fling, say hello.
Good evening, everybody. Rob Fling, the next chief from Long Island. And as always, Pete, very glad to be here.
Yeah, no, you bring a lot to the table. And Rob and I are kind of Rob is going to talk about the volunteer perspective here of being an officer, which certainly complicates the issue a little bit. I think I'll just run the panel on this one. All of us will dive in on this one. Making the hard right decision. I talk with officers all over the country, and they will invariably tell me something like, well, being an officer is great. I get more money a week, or, I get to tell people what to do in the volunteer sector, or I get to do anything. Yeah, it's not really too bad. I haven't had many challenges. When you say making a hard right decision, and one of the things I put in my notes to the panelists, folks, is that, every decision you make has consequences, either good or bad. Let's just get an opening statement, if we will. Chief Pernesti, why is a decision hard? What makes a decision hard? We got two descriptives there, hard and right. What makes a hard decision, Chief?
I think right up the front, personality, or you're going to look friendships, especially for a new officer. So whatever you do, it's probably going to put a strain on your personal relationships with those that you're leading, and that right there is probably the hardest thing for an officer.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that personal friendships and stuff in the station. You grew up with the crew, or you've been with the crew, and then you're promoted, and you get the first phrase that comes out of that is, you forgot where you came from. It's tossed back at you. Generally, that's the phrase. So that's a good one. Chief Cagno, hard right decision. What do those two adjectives mean to you?
Well, when you make a decision, we know that there's always consequences, but what is the lasting effect? Who else is it going to influence? Is it going to be another group? Is it going to be the entire department, the agency involved? The other stakeholders that it's going to affect. So when you're making a difficult decision, it could influence a wide variety of factors, more so than just the individual that you might have a problem with. It could be a more global problem rather than an individual personnel problem.
Yeah, it's a good one. We may come back to that in the discussion because you might have stumbled upon something that has wider ranging impacts. Chief Burns, you worked in a career organization, hard, right decision, consequences. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Chief, I agree with everything that's been said. I might just throw one little twist in there. I think a lot depends on how you've conducted yourself before you have to make the hard, right decision. We talk about the hard environment of the fire ground being dictated to by the soft environment. And I think how you make those hard decisions, or I'll say it makes them a little easier to make if you've been a squared away company officer right from the get-go, starting with competency. So I think if you've sort of laid the groundwork, when those hard right decisions come, they're a little bit easier. Not easy, but easier based on your past performance.
Excellent. Very well said. You triggered something that we're definitely going to go back and revisit there for sure. Thank you for that, Kevin. Lane, pretty big size organization. You've got the largest career organization represented here. How does this work in your world? Hard, right, and consequences. Let's talk about that.
Well, I think John touched on it, talking about in terms of, who the stakeholders are in the decision. There's a lot of decisions that you make that may not be popular with the fellas, but are right for our customer, the citizens who are actually, paying the bill and stuff like that. And then again, being the fact that I am in management, as a battalion chief, but I'm also a member of the same local as the firefighters. So it's a fine line that we have to walk. Up through battalion chief, we're all members of local 145. So it's, a little. It doesn't often come into conflict, but occasionally you feel as if you have to serve two masters in some regard.
Right. Yeah, and I actually reached out to Chief Pernesti to talk about that very same subject, so the two of you can bounce off of that. I think John was in that same environment as well. Not sure about Kevin. Rob, a whole nother world when you're the volunteer boss and when you may get elected or unelected. Let's talk about hard, right decisions and consequences. What does that mean in your environment?
Well, I think for especially a new officer, one of the things that they need to realize is that as they move up the ladder, there's a proportionate to, as you move up, the amount of influence your decisions have affect more and more people. And something that you hear all the time within the volunteer service, like Chief Pronesti brought up, where it's the friendship. And I always tried to remember two things. If in a position where I had to make a hard decision, they probably weren't my friend, because a friend would never do that to somebody else. And then the other thing is, if you have to make a hard decision, you have to be able to separate. Your friends should be able to separate professionalism and friendship. And if they respect it, they need to respect that the decision that you made, for whatever reason that you made it. And if they don't, again, how good of a friend actually are they? They should take that into consideration.
Yeah. No, well said, Rob. I'm going to hit on a couple of things. We won't necessarily run the panel, but if a panelist has a comment to make, just give me the sign, and I'll get you to dive out there. Tapping off what you just said, Chief Fling, and going back to what Chief Burns said. Chief Burns said, I think he used the term squared away. If you're a good squared away officer at the start, you'll do that. how important is consistency in behavior? See, when people talk about making hard decisions, if you've been doing that consistently, well, they're not always so hard anymore. But if you are providing inconsistent, I'm doing something different for one guy than I do on another day, I do something there. How important is consistency in making these decisions a little bit easier? Chief Cagno.
Absolutely. I think it's paramount to making any decision. As soon as you start to show that there's a little inconsistency in your decision making, that spreads right into the rumor mill right away. I think the first thing that needs to be said, along with being consistent, is being decisive. You can't slowly make that decision. You always got to have a decisive decision along with that consistency. But anytime you lag behind or you show a little bit of bipartisan, it gets right into the rumor mill, and then you start getting a diversion of amongst the ranks.
Well, we've talked a lot about dealing with the pressures of the ranks from below us. We've talked a lot about, losing a friendship or whatever. What about if you're in the middle, right? So you folks that are battalion chiefs, you got deputies or assistants or chief of departments over your head. So you're actually, I had an officer explain it to me one day as what he called a tenacious claw. You're in the middle. There's somebody above you and there's somebody below you, and they're exerting pressure on you in two different directions. Would anybody like to comment just how have you been taught to handle that pressure? So you made a decision, and we'll talk about some of these in a minute. You've made a decision. It had a negative consequence. How have you been, what tips or techniques could you give some of our viewers that are out there? And folks in the chat room, if you'd like to dive in here, or if you have a specific question, now's the time to ask it. Chief Woolery, answer that one if you don't mind.
Pete, the promise I made myself when I put on a gold badge was that I realized that part of my job is to, pardon the French, but serve up the shit, slice up the shit sandwich every once in a while and serve it up to the fellas. But I made a promise to myself that I was never going to tell them it was pumpkin pie when I was serving it up, and so a lot of times there's policies that, I don't want to say I disagree with them, all thought out, and a lot of reasons that the guys don't necessarily like the reason the policy is being implemented, but it's being done for very good and sound reasons that they may not appreciate at their level. But, I never want to undermine the chain of command and say, well, this is what the boss has said we got to do. But at the same time, I'm not going to tell them, look, I get that you don't dig this policy and I understand it. Here we deploy on strike teams, and there's been some changes in how we go about staffing the rigs to deploy out on strike teams on large fires. And it's done for some very sound reasons, but at the same time, I get why the guys don't dig it. And, I fully appreciate that. And I'm never going to tell them, hey, here's how it is. Just suck it up and go with it. I definitely want to hear what they have to say. And, and then I'm also willing to share those concerns up with I had a very spirited discussion with my boss a week ago over some of the issues surrounding this policy.
Excellent. I think you brought up a couple of good points there. We started with consistency, and then you're certainly talking about being truthful. You as a new officer, you clearly have to be truthful. Excuse for a minute. That's going to take us right into a question out of the chat room. So let me get to that. So it's an incident where a rookie didn't clean their gear after a grease fire. The next shift, the technician told him he needed to take it out of service. When the technician calls the BC, he was told to leave it and not worry about it. Policy in this particular department is to have a second set of gear at our logistics warehouse, but the particular BC said that they did not need the other set of gear. The technician that made that decision has had cancer twice, and just doesn't want to be around people with dirty turnout gear when there's probably not a reason. So this is a young man that's asking a question. Matt has a question. He is just promoted to a lieutenant about 2.5 weeks ago. So he's posing that question to the panel. So let me just kind of summarize it for you. So the policy indicates that there's a second set of gear. The technician involved has this is a personal relationship. The technician had cancer twice, and it kind of gets passed on. No, we don't need to change out or clean the gear in question. Chief Fling, how do you dive in there?
I would probably either meet up with that battalion chief or state my concerns, my case. I'd let him know that, you know what, especially if the chief has not seen the gear, somebody's got to let him know, look, chief, this is what happened. This gear really needs to come out of service for decontamination. And I'd really wish that he might even state the personal reasons that he has it. Maybe he won't. But I need to make this. I know you made this decision, but I think it needs to be done. And I'd really like you to back me on this one. I think we got to do this.
Nice. Well said. Matt, question from one of the panels are, so you're a lieutenant. Where do you fit into this puzzle? In other words, does the technician report to you? Are you involved here? What is your role as a lieutenant, or are you just looking for advice in case this happened to you? You may want to answer that. Chief Cagno, did you want to dive in on that?
Well, if there's a policy and the policy isn't being followed, there's the first infraction. So, you know, it starts right there. Pushing the personal issue aside, it's a policy. So, you know, there's the first major mistake.
Yeah, good, and I think that's a good one. Chief Burns, weigh in, please.
Yes, Chief, and I agree with Chief Cagno. It's a policy, and it's an important policy. You know, we've come a long way in realizing how important it is to clean our gear. And if this guy's got a second set that fits him and he can change into, boy, to me, that's a no-brainer. You wash your gear after the grease fire, get into your spare gear. It's a policy, but it's an important policy for the safety of the members in a primary way. You got to enforce that. Now, maybe as Chief Pernesti's asked, you know, maybe the BC deals with this guy's officer, not the guy, but it's got to be adhered to in this case. I don't think there's a question.
Yeah, the other thing, John, can you mute your mic? You're taking over the channel a little bit when you do that. There's a question in my mind, a shameless plug. You know, the podcast today, I talked about what happened to Johnny. He stopped reading and stopped learning. I think years ago, I don't think I would have cared about dirty gear. Years ago, I wore dirty gear. But as we know what we know now, I think that it becomes more important to me now when we talk about skin absorption, when we talk about contaminants, when we talk about long-term effects. I think it makes a difference. Here's the other comment. So the person involved is the engine driver. This incident occurred OT on another shift. So this lieutenant's hearing it kind of secondhand. And he also said that he believes that not everyone has a second set of gear. They share them, they swap them out. So if there's a size 40 or whatever, you grab the size 40 jacket or whatever. So the panel wants to weigh in. So Chief Pernesti.
Excuse me. Probably not the right thing to say as an experienced veteran, but if I could give some advice to younger officers, is sometimes if it doesn't directly affect you, you have to stay in your own lane. And what I mean by that is if this was something that you had to deal with yourself, if this person was your firefighter or something, then by all means. If it's happening on another shift and you have a battalion chief breaking policy, I'm not saying it's right, but you have to be very cautious. It's probably one of the tougher things to do as a young officer. but you also don't want to start casting stones as a new officer, if that makes sense. I'm not, and I'm not condoning any of this, but you have to be very cautious. You have to stay in your own lane. And I'm not saying that this is one of those kind of fights, but it sounds to me that this officer is either getting secondhand information, doesn't have the whole story. Sometimes you need to have the whole story. That's the real point here as an officer. If you're going to make a decision, you got to have the whole story. And when you're not on that involved, you may not have all the facts to comment or have a issue. And one of the worst things, finally, is to be a very opinionated officer on things that don't necessarily pertain directly to you. What I mean by that is A shift doesn't clean kitchen and you're a lieutenant on C shift. You have to make sure your shift's in accordance to the rules and do things. And you can't worry about another shift all the time.
Yeah, I think that's some good advice. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you played it correctly, Chief, in that, as a 2-week lieutenant, I'm not sure I'm going to pick on the battalion chief. Pick your shot there and make sure you're gathering all the facts. I think that's a great decision. Chief Woolery, what are you thinking?
Well, you mentioned that, maybe they don't have the second set of gear because he's a new guy or whatever. And see, that's the problem with policy is that policy is all well and good as a guiding document, but sooner or later you sail into uncharted waters, and I have this dream, and it's probably naive, but I envision a day when my whole battalion, everybody working for me all has the same vision. So they understand what the objective is, what the mission is at hand. And they realize, okay, this kid doesn't have a second set of gear, but the intent, the objective, the overarching goal is to not have him running around in dirty gear exposed to toxins. So that empowers that officer to make good decisions in support of that objective. That is really the perfect world, because, we can't craft enough policies to cover every eventuality. And what really empowers our people to make good decisions is if we can, inculcate them with those values of what we're really trying to end up with.
Yeah. It's easy to make a good decision if you can see the finish line. Well said, Lane, well said. I also think that, just let me clarify on this one, that the technician did not want to ride with the person with dirty gear. So the dirty gear was an exposure to a second person. I think it was Chief Cagno. Chief, do you want to dive in?
Yeah, we talked about the consistency issue, and I think it was Chief Vanessa that started it. The worst thing we can do as officers is not align ourselves or follow up and agree with decisions that other officers are making relative to rules. In other words, if A shift doesn't do the clean kitchens, we can't say, well, the heck with A shifts, we're going to do it a different way. We need to have that consistency with, any type of decision making. So if an officer on A group or in the volunteer world, a particular company makes a decision that's based on the rules or regulatory issue, an officer on another group has to back him up. He can't go contrary to whatever that decision was. He has to agree with it. And we have a lot of that in the fire service, especially on the paid end of things. We've seen it, you and I have seen it on a number of occasions, Pete, where it causes great conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's a basis of officer training. See, I've been told to empower my officer. So empower in his world means that he thinks he has a right to do what it is he wants to do, regardless of what the other shift's doing. I think, John, you're aware of when I teach, I use an airplane analogy. We're all on the plane. We're all on the plane. So we got to be going to the same destination. As Lane said, that's, we're going to the same place. And the more misery we create in the rows isn't going to make the ride very pleasant. So bad analogy, but I think that's how it works. So I think we answered Matt. Matt, we got some advice there. If you want to reach out after by email, we can follow up. We also, Christine asks a question, which I think is very relevant. I think I'll start where anybody can answer this one. This came in on Twitter, and that is, do you have a problem when your organization has elected a young chief officer? So I'm reaching out to you, Rob. There's a young chief officer that's just been elected and still believes that they're one of the guys, in quotations. So I don't think that's an uncommon problem, but just a couple of quick things from the panel on how that might work. Rob, go ahead.
First thing that comes to my mind is you elected them. You know, sometimes it comes down to the lesser of two evils. I've seen it happen over and over again. Hey, nobody wants a position. Somebody's going to jump in and they're going to take it. In the volunteer service, there's only really a couple of things that you can do. You can either try to get this guy to see what's going on, guide him in the path. Hopefully he's not chief of department where he has the say of everything. Hopefully he just got elected into the chief's office. He's an assistant chief. Yeah, he may think he's one of the guys yet, but you know, if he just got on, like the lieutenant that's only been on 2 weeks, may take him a while to get his wheels. Guidance. That's the only thing unfortunately you can do. But going into a election, you know the person that that is running in the election. You don't have to vote for them. You end up holding the power, and a lot of people in the volunteer service don't realize that.
Yeah, well said, Rob. And I think that, you know, you did say something, and I think probably the first time that I was in a volunteer organization and got elected as chief, I think I was the lesser of two evils as a young volunteer, because I probably was not ready to be chief, but I was the only person ready at that time to be chief. And that is a real life for you folks on the career side. That's going on across middle America every day. Believe me when I tell you that decision goes out.
You have volunteer chiefs showing up to run a fire that have never been to a fire. It happens.
Right. And it's this election process, you know, again, you know, the stuff that I do, right? This is a training situation. I'm a fan. I've tried to consult a couple of departments, and that is 5 people, any 5 people you want have to go to 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks of training, whatever it is. And then you can elect from one of those 5.
Yep.
Right. But that's not the way bylaws are written. That's not the way these old traditional organizations are written. But that's a way where at least you're voting on a pool that may be a little more qualified.
I've even seen it where somebody they have a folder stacked full of qualifications like this, but it means nothing. They can't do any of it. They just sat in class. They've never used any of it on the street. They just sat in class. It looks good on the resume until the interview, as they say in business.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I think that the other key point that I'd like to pass is, we're talking about making the hard right decision here. I have to tell you, you said something. A new officer deserves a break. At some point, you know, the troops, you know, well, he got promoted to captain yesterday. He must be a genius. That's just not the way it works. And officers will make mistakes, and officers do need guidance from some folks underneath and from folks like us. I mean, this is a pretty cool panel for us tonight. We have got probably the widest range of experience of anything I've seen, you know, and we're across the United States. We got Joe in the middle, Kevin, John, and I from the East, Rob from the volunteer sector, and Lane from the West. This is the kind of group that can mentor young officers. So, Chris, I hope that answered your question. We may need to give them a little space The group is the one that elected them, and they need feedback at some point. Officers need feedback. See, the problem is firefighters will tend to walk into the other room and have the conversation about the officer rather than trying to have a civil conversation with the officer.
If you
Chief
don't say
Gagnon.
anything, they're going to think they're doing a great job.
Right. Chief Gagnon.
Yeah, we spend an awful lot of time in educating our firefighters when they become officers on how to fight a fire, how to command a fire, what to do in the front seat. But we don't spend nearly enough time in educating them on decision making, problem solving, and how to actually conduct themselves as officers. They may take a test in some departments to get to that step, but we don't give them, I don't think, enough of fuel and education to go on to be a better rounded officer. And I think that's part of the weak link. And now, you can get the experience along the way, but if we was to groom these people earlier as they make their first step into the lieutenant seat, and then further education as they become a captain, company officer, when they become middle management as battalion chiefs or whatever, they usually have all the wherewithal to do the right decision making, make the hard choices. So, we don't spend nearly enough time educating our firefighters in this regards.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably accurate. I think in some cases, career police departments do a better job than Fireside does. Chief Woolery.
Yeah, the fire service has always historically lagged in leadership training. You look at the U.S. military; all branches, they give leadership training to their personnel, from cradle to grave through their whole career. And most departments have been, lacking in that. I remember when I started in my career, to promote to captain or battalion chief, you just had to exam, and there was an interview. Periodically, they would have some kind of a fire simulator, but now, fortunately, they've rolled out we've had prereqs for captain and for battalion chief to sit the test, and part of that is leadership training. We've taken advantage of the leadership training that's come out of the wildland world. The U.S. Forest Service, because of a couple of very catastrophic fires, started to look at their culture and developed a leadership curriculum. And that's some good stuff. The L 180, 280, 380, and 480 series. It's a really good source of leadership training and real valuable stuff.
Nice. We shifted away from this. We had a couple of questions. And again, if somebody's in the chat room and has questions, or if you're watching us live, want to throw something out on Twitter, we'll be happy to get to you. So, Rob, you've had to make a difficult decision that had negative consequences, maybe for you. The negative consequence probably was for you. How did you manage that? What can you share with the group? A full disclaimer, any stories, all names have been changed to protect the innocent in case the statute of limitations hasn't run out. But Rob, so a hard decision, it had some negative consequences, and how did you manage that?
I think you need to keep in mind that it's not about me, it's about we. It's definitely not you. It's definitely for the betterment of the department, or like Lane said, for the customer. You're never going to please everybody. Absolutely not. So don't even try to do it. If you make a decision that affects you personally, and it could be for anything. Somebody told me once that if you make a decision and you could sleep at night, you probably made the good decision. And that's basically what it is about. You have to separate yourself from yourself and make the decision on behalf of the organization. Is it going to better the organization? Is it going to better serve my community? Is it a safety thing? The list can go on and on. But sometimes you got to sacrifice what you want to do for the betterment of the organization, no doubt.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I think that is a good test. Chief Burns, negative consequence. How did you manage it? How'd you deal with it?
Chief, I may have said this on other panels, but it's so important to have someone outside the organization that you can use as a sounding board. I know the 5 gentlemen that are on this panel, I could call any of them if I had an issue. Hey, I ran into this. This is what I did. What do you think? Or this is coming up. What do you think? To have that outside sounding board, someone that you can trust. And I think also, Chief, someone of a similar rank too, is invaluable. And you know, going off the grid a little, it's great to have a supportive spouse that you know, she's going to love you no matter what. And it's great to be able to come home to family and have that support. And that's a two-way street. That means you're always putting your family first. Even though I love the fire service, you know, it's got to come second to family. So anyway, just a couple thoughts.
Yeah, no, great. That's good information. And that's kind of the intent of this roundtable tonight. If we have young officers watching us or listening to us, these are people that you can reach out to help guide you or do that. I think the feedback and questions coming from the crowd is a good decision. Chief Pernesti, you've been quiet for a couple minutes. So a negative decision, how do you deal with the consequence that's not a good one? How have you managed that in the past? I know you've had those situations. I think we all have. What did you do? How did you handle it?
Well, at the time, I did what I felt was right, and you know, you suffer for a while, and you know, it's affected some friendships. But at the end of the day, you know what? It's hard to see it now, but time heals a lot of wounds. Things move on, and again, we're all from the same fire service, but I think we can all agree that. You're only minutes away from your next controversial thing in the fire service, in your firehouse. You're only, and everybody quickly forgets the issue that you had, and they move on to the next. So make the decision that you feel is right, and I know it's hard for me to tell certain people this, but to know that, you know, things will be okay. You'll move on. This too in time shall pass. A young lieutenant or an old lieutenant told me a long time ago, just to always remember that this too in time shall pass. And he was right. He's still right to this day.
Yep. No, that's good advice. Chief Cagno, a negative consequence. How did you deal with it? What did you do to get through that period of time where you were maybe questioning yourself, as Chief Pernesti so well said, you know, can you sleep at night or whatever? Well, maybe the first night, maybe you can't sleep because you're wondering and you're wrestling that. It's pretty easy for a new officer to wrestle with decisions. You know, when I was a kid, I thought I had monsters under my bed. I realized later they were bad decisions under my bed. That's what they were. Go ahead, Chief.
Right. I think the first thing you got to do is take ownership and then communicate with your people and then explain to them that, you know, whatever decision, whatever you did was wrong, and why it was wrong. And, you know, maybe even why you came to that reason before you made that decision. But you got to take ownership for it. And then the other thing is, maybe you were the problem. Maybe you were part of the issue. Maybe you didn't clearly itemize expectations or something. So maybe you're part and parcel of the problem. So whenever you take ownership of whatever it is that happened, I think it goes away a lot quicker. Whenever you're very candid and honest, and take the hit, you walk away from it more favorably.
Yeah, and I would just, the only line I'd put at the end of that is do it quickly. You do it quickly. In other words, the sooner you do that, the better off you're going to be. Lane, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I was actually I was just referencing a TED talk here that I found. A guy by the name of Bob Davids used the term leadership without ego, and yeah, that's important. You know, a lot of us were type A personalities. We promote up, and a lot of times I've come to grief. It's largely been my own ego to blame. So yeah, and like John was just saying, ownership, and yeah, and checking your ego. And a lot of time that's easier said than done.
Yeah, one of the biggest fallacies we teach, there's so many buzzwords and there's so many things. So here's a fallacy in Pete's world, and it's not a fallacy. It's just one of those things that I don't think we tell the whole story. There's a phrase: separate the people from the problem. A great phrase, absolutely. What does it mean in real life? I'm one of the people. Chief Flink said, this is about the group. This is not about me. But when you separate the people from the problem, look at the incident. I had a situation where I had to severely discipline a very, very close friend. And I have to tell you, I'm not going to lie to anybody on the panel or somebody that watches this 6 months from now. This was a big deal for me. I made the right decision. I felt that I did make the right decision, but it was a painful decision. And one of the trainings that I do is, what would you do if your mother was the incident commander? And I joke about the fact that my mother always said, if she was going to spank us or something, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. And to meter out discipline as a new officer comes with a couple of bumps and grinds on occasion. And I think that officers that are listening to this, or potential new officers, or maybe even a seasoned officer, just think about that. You are going to have some bumps and grinds. This is not going to be a ride in a convertible on a sunny, great day every day. If you're going to do it, you have to be able to be ready to make some of those hard, right decisions. As we get this, John prepared a couple of things, but let's go. What do you do? Somebody said a couple of things. I'd like to run the panel and go down. Before you make a decision, what are you thinking about? And I'd ask the panel. So somebody said early on, we weren't into this 5 minutes. They said, make sure you got all the facts. I think the quote that came out was, it's Chief Burns, facts before acts. Make sure you know what you're talking about. So that's one. Rob, what else do you do when you've got a pretty good decision? Let's teach some folks that are watching us how to make decisions.
I think one of the things you need to remember when you have a decision to make is, number one, take your time. Every decision doesn't need to be made with a knee-jerk reaction. And number two, it's just like going to a fire. Do your 360. Get all sides of it before you make your final decision. And try to look at the problem from different people's point of view. It may help you see it a little clearer.
Yeah, it's a good, that's a good takeaway for the folks watching tonight. Do a 360 on problem solving. Make sure you've looked all around on all sides of it. Lane, how do you, what steps do you take when you're kind of making a decision?
Well, yeah, again, there's always avoid that risk or that temptation to immediately take action. But the other thing that I've learned is that a lot of times the father-son chat, if you will, is what I like to call it, where you just directly, regardless of the policy or the specific problem, you share with the individual that's like, look, this is what's going on, and it's it's caused me a lot of heartburn. And what I'm really looking for is the buy-in from the person, trying to really understand where I'm coming from and understand where we're trying to get to. That's far more effective than any written warning or reprimand on a piece of paper. And I apologize for my neighbor's dog.
That's okay. Blame the neighbor. That's right. It's sort of, I've actually, thought I was at headquarters there for a few minutes, because when people were talking, there's a lot of barking going on. So that can happen in the fire station for sure. But, that's a good piece of advice. I think that more importantly, forget about the who, but explain the why. And you may, that's just get rid of the who for a minute and worry about the why. Why am I asking you to do this? Why didn't you do what you're supposed to do? And why becomes an important question there. Chief Burns, before you're making a decision, what are some things going through your mind?
Chief, I think certainly making the decision in a timely fashion, as Chief Fling said, it might not have to happen right away, but I would say, within let's say a shift, if it's any sort of a decision of consequence, you got to make that decision. And firemen appreciate when decisions are made, even if they don't like the decision. They would rather have a decision that they didn't like than one that wasn't made at all. So I would wait no more than one shift, but maybe it would be wise to wait a shift. Obviously, never discipline in anger. Maybe seek some counsel, like I talked about. And again, Chief, not to beat a dead horse, but I'd just like to go back to my first point of the night was to be technically competent, to be a good fire officer. That's going to go a long way to taking some of the heat off you. If they respect that you know your job and you're going to keep them safe when the what hits the fan, then boy, that buys you some credibility when the going gets tough, so to speak, with decisions. So work on your technical competence, number one, I think.
Excellent, excellent. And so Chief Cagno is he created this little thing based on the what he's calling the DECIDE method, and that's kind of vaguely familiar to something we heard about before. So Chief, why don't you talk about this acronym, if you would?
Yeah, it's just a quick down and dirty way of formulating a decision. Some of the things you need to think about. First, obviously we've all talked about this on the panel. Determine what the problem is. Maybe this is a problem that you shouldn't even be handling. It should maybe go to a higher level. The next thing is the E, or examine all the facts. Don't make a rush to judgment. Gather all the critical information, based on the severity of the issue. So you need to get all the facts and are them facts valid? C, collect all your thoughts. Like Chief Burns said, you don't want to be stressed out or tired or emotional when you make a decision. So collect your thoughts. Always try to use intuition or experiences when to help you along with your decision-making process, but don't be reactionary. Identify consequences. This may have a long-lasting impression on a large group of people, depending on what your decision is. So weigh the consequences. Then you got to develop a course of action, and then execute a decisive decision. So it's just a quick way to break down all the facts that we need to take into consideration. You can pick up any book out there, and there's a wealth of information. I just use this, something I coined to just kind of help me make a decision. Something I use when I'm teaching officer classes.
Good. Chief Bernestik, how thoughts you make before you do the before you make the decision? What are you thinking about? What's your thought process? How can we share that with somebody?
Well, to back up real quick, I'd like to make one more recommendation to newly promoted officers or any
Sure.
officer. Lay your expectations out immediately with your crew. So let's say you're a new lieutenant, you walk into Firehouse at 0800 or the start of your tour, and you're assigned to Engine 1. Going into that day, think about what is important and safe and your expectations. And you don't need to have a laundry list, but lay it out with your crew. This is what I expect. They'll respect you for it. They may razz you a little bit, you may get a little bit, but you must lay out your expectations. Guys on my shift know I got 3 rules. I got 3 rules. That's it. 3 rules that if you break, it's automatic. You're going to wear your seatbelt. You're going to come off the rig with your PPE and SCBA on for all, fire alarm drops, natural gas, the BS kind of calls it. You're going to come off the truck ready to go, and the exhaust system will be hooked up to the pumper or the trucks in the stations. Now that's because it's a little bit of an issue at my place at one time. It's not when I'm working. 3 rules. I got 3 rules. Then everything else is okay. We'll talk about it. I finally make the final decision, but everybody knows my expectations. And I sit down with all my officers beginning of the year and I reiterate them, and new officers, I sit down with them and give them my expectations. And it's besides those 3 rules, but my expectations. But I only have 3 hard and fast rules that you'll get disciplined on doggone near immediately. My guys are clear, loud and clear with those. They don't bust them.
Good, good. So jump in. How do you, what do you think about, how do you manage before you make a decision, Chief?
I think it goes by my past experience. If it is a very difficult problem, I'll reach out to like you guys. I have had some very difficult decisions. One had to do with race, and not, with 2 individuals who had some issues there. I handled it the best I could, but you can't knee jerk it. But you got to help. You got to do the right thing. You just got to. But you got to reach out to mentors on those kind of tough decisions. And one last thing: the higher up you are, the tougher the decision and the more singular the decision will be. You're an assistant chief. You're probably the only one that can make the decision. A captain can go to his assistant chief. A lieutenant can go to his captain. You're not alone. You get up to the point where there's nobody above you, you're it. And as a shift commander with me, I'm the only, the only guy I can consult is the chief. And, you got the buck stops with you. But I never make a knee-jerk reaction. I always bounce it off of mentors. And the only ones that I'll change immediately and fix are safety ones.
Right. Right. Good point. We talked about, I kind of just used the catch-all out there, hard right decisions. I'm just going to bounce some out there. I'd ask any of the panel if you want to add to this list. Let me tell you decisions that I've made that were hard decisions. Chief Pernesti just talked about, if you have a racial issue, that's going to be a hard decision. I think by definition. I think if you have a decision that is related somehow in some sexual nature, I think that's a hard decision. Those are decisions, and listen, all decisions are hard to some level. I'm talking about things that are going to rise to make the hair on your neck stand up. And they also are so infrequent. Officer problems are much like Gordon Graham, high risk, low frequency. You don't have those. You might not have one of those for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So I think if you have a racial incident, I think that's an issue. I think if you have a incident that is of a sexual nature, that's an issue. I think if you have a hard and fast criminal act, if you have a member that is criminally charged, well, misdemeanor, felony, I don't really care. I think if you have a member that's arrested, I think that's a big deal. I think, and I'm starting to go down the level a little bit, I think a severe substance abuse issue, there's a whole safety thing or what have you there. That's there. Anybody want to add? Lane, you want to, any of the panel can add in, but when we're talking about hard decisions, those seem to rise to a level. Lane, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, and it's funny, when you say hard decision, a lot of times the consequences of those decisions end up being hard or maybe harsh, if you will. But a lot of times those decisions are relatively easy to make. Especially, again, I was talking about, having everybody on board with the same value system, and if everybody believes in treating everybody in the organization with respect and dignity, somebody steps outside that line, it's very easy to make that decision that, hey, that you're stepped outside and that's not tolerated. That's not our culture. I'm not having that going on around me. Now you touched on substance abuse. That's a little trickier, because it's less cut and dried. I mean, we have a random drug testing policy. Somebody goes in and pees dirty. Well, then that decision's all out of my hand and it's taken care of. But it's the other things, the tardies, the missing work, and some of those performance issues that skirt around that and tiptoe. It's like, well, is it a substance abuse problem? And that's where we've talked about, reaching out to a mentor or a fellow officer, you know, your boss or one of your counterparts. You know, I've got 6 other battalion chiefs on duty on any given day, and I can always sound my concerns off of one of those guys.
Excellent. Excellent. Well said. Chief Burns, do you want to add into Lane? That was some good stuff. Do you want to dive in anyway there, Chief Burns?
I have had a little bit of experience, Pete, with substance abuse problems, and boy, they are difficult. But I know I've told guys they got to go home, you know, and you can't fool with this stuff anymore. You know, years ago, I know there was drinking in the firehouse, especially on the old shifts. You know, 10s and 14s. You cannot mess with substance abuse, and if I think a guy's impaired. Now, I might not, depending on the situation, I might just say he's going home sick, and then, you know, he and I will monitor what's going on, and at one point I'll have to kick that up to upstairs if it's a repeat. But you cannot let anybody stay on the job if they're impaired in any way.
Yep. Well said. Well said. Chief Pernesti.
The backup Chief Burns. In 2017, remember this, new officers, all officers, if something happens, it's going to be your butt that's going to get fried. So you have an impaired individual who stays on duty and you know about it. The truth's going to end up coming out. If something, God forbid, happens and somebody gets hurt, especially outside the department or even inside the department, they're going to say, Lieutenant so-and-so knew, Assistant Chief so-and-so knew, you're going to get fried. And so always remember that consequence, that if you don't do something, your job, your profession, your professional whatever is going to be in jeopardy. Because in 2017, they go after the big fish and they want to, you know, it's just the way it is. So always remember that if you're going to make a decision, you might have to ask yourself, is this going to come back on me? I don't want it to sound selfish, but as an officer, to do the right thing, if you have trouble making that decision, ask your wife, hey, you know, this is happening. If I don't do this, I could lose my job. You could, or get demoted, and then you'll be kicking yourself.
Yeah, I would just say, I think the most powerful phrase, and we're going to have to summarize here pretty quick, folks. Great discussion. It's been a great discussion. But to echo your point, Chief, one of the greatest things that was ever said to me, and I'll never forget it, and it was an attorney in a courtroom, and the conversation went, Chief, when did you know, or when should you have known? And I'll never forget that phrase as long as I live. When did you know, or when should you have known? And boy, if you're an officer today, I think you need to remember that phrase. If I didn't leave you with anything, I think I'd do that. A couple of quick commercial, and then I'll just have the panel give their social media info if you'd like to do that. So the commercial is, if you would like to have this panel or a panel like this in your department some evening, you'd like us to come in, you can ask questions, you can do what you want to do. Let's do that. Let's think about it. We can assemble a panel, and you can just give us your questions right from your room in your firehouse, and we can be more specific in some cases. Rob Fling, where can people find you if they're looking for you on social media?
They can find me on Twitter at FacePeaceOn, and you can always send me an email, robertdfling@gmail.com.
Thanks. Lane, how do we find you on social media or other places?
Best place to find me is on Twitter at SuncoastChief.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. Chief Burns, you're everywhere now. Chief Burns is published, and he's doing some fire engineering blogs. He's on Twitter. He's not even going to remember the little people someday. I'm telling you, it's going to. Chief Burns, how do we find you?
You know what else is everywhere, Chief?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, Chief, I'm on Twitter at Burns227, or I guess you can just search my name. Same Facebook, Kevin Burns. And my email is burns227@comcast.net. And if anything I can do to help, I'd be happy to. It'd be my privilege to help. So thank you.
Great stuff. Chief Cagno, how do we find you?
You can find me on Twitter and Facebook, or you can follow my webpage, leadit.com, johncagnolleadit.com.
All right, perfect. Chief Pernesti, how do we find you?
I'm on Twitter, EFD Chief 3. And as far as email, efdchief3@outlook.com. And I'm here to help, just like you guys are. If you're an officer and want some help or bounce some ideas off, any one of us will help you. I'll help you out.
Right. Thank you. Well, this was a great panel. Time just slipped away from us. It was a good discussion. I appreciate the viewers and listeners in the chat room. I would ask the viewers and folks, ship out the link for this video. There is good information for new officers here in this video, and it can be watched a lot later somewhere else. So Ken, thank you. Ken happy Thanksgiving from Canada. I like it. Happy Columbus Day. He covered them all. Good. I love it. All right. Thank you much, folks. And we will see you here next week.